So I presented a talk that really sort of surveys the landscape of the use of next-generation sequencing assays in clinical cancer medicine. So focusing on affordability, which is really more about reimbursement models, how are people paying for these tests, accessibility, how are people able to access the tests if they want to have their DNA tested from their cancer genome, is that available to them, what are the different models for that? And then really focusing in on what are the data being used for? Are we demonstrating a utility for patients to get their DNA tested, getting them onto clinical trials? Is there any clinical benefit of this testing? And so that was really the sort of breadth of the talk that I gave. So it's kind of interesting because, of course, in the US we have a strange, very different than the rest of the world model with private insurers as well as the government providing some insurance coverage for patients. And so really the government model for payment dictates what the private insurers do. So there has been some movement in that regard of late, and I talked a little bit about where that's at in the fact that the CMS, which is our government agency for public healthcare dollars, is now covering some of these NGS panel tests for cancer patients. And that indeed some of the US private insurers have now followed suit in also offering some payment for those. The payment is small compared to the price of most of the tests to conduct, but it's something. And that's really, the minimum affordability, I guess you would say. There are companies in the US that will test for a price that one can pay out of pocket the cancer sample that's been obtained from a patient. And so I discussed some of those and what they offer. And then there are obviously extreme examples such as very high net worth individuals who get a cancer diagnosis, make contact with someone who's very high profile in the cancer community and use that person's network to really put together their own sort of private healthcare advisory group, a molecular tumor board of your own, if you will. So those are kind of the, minimum to the absolute extremes, yeah. Well, that's the challenge in all of this, is that large-scale cancer discovery has told us a lot about the cancer genome, much of which is, I would say, largely uninterpretable. And so I think this is the challenge of sequencing through many genes or all genes, is that we often have a lot of information but don't necessarily know what to do with it. So this is a challenge. In that regard, I highlighted some of the open source and openly accessible databases that we've put together with my group to really help coalesce information as it develops, sort of almost in real time, using a crowdsourcing model to have people from the oncology field actively contributing information into these databases so that others can benefit from it. And I think this sort of broad scale open source open contribution model is a good one because our tendency is to sort of silo this information or keep it private within our own healthcare systems, whereas fairly rare mutations could be helpful to other groups that are finding them and one-off patients and understanding how other people have treated those mutations, whether they got a response or not, et cetera, are sort of, I think, all in the mix. And so this is one way to stay on top of this, incredible and ever-developing source of information. We know that every patient's genome stitches together different drivers and different factors to create cancer. And so at one end of the spectrum, it is highly personalized. At the other end of the spectrum, I think we can learn a lot from each other and from the patients that are being individually cared for in a personalized way, if you will, at different places. And so that's really the emphasis that we've put on open data sharing. This is one of the reasons for coming to a meeting like this, is just that there are so many perspectives that get offered up, and importantly so. I think there's a lot of information that's being exchanged here about not just doing NGS testing, but the reality of clinical care of patients with targeted therapies versus immunotherapies, some really clever approaches to new therapeutic interventions such as the exosome work that we've been hearing about. Blood-based monitoring is a huge area of interest for patients who are on therapies because it's maybe a more immediate and more day-to-day way of monitoring their response or lack of response to a therapy, et cetera. So it's a very, very exciting time no matter what anyone says, just because there's so much going on and so much potential, I think, to bring it together for individual cancer patients.